Well, I will take the official part. But as you can see, we are actually, as I said already, I mean, it's a mixed group, graduate students, students of other departments, scholars of the department. And I mean, however, what is very important is we are all interested actually in issues related to migration or work, labor migration, aspects like this. Now, in specific, maybe let me just give a very, very short intro to your CV. Very short. Look, it's very short. I mean, you know, quantity is not quality. So, I mean, in my sense, it's a small little paper. But, I mean, what is important really is Juan Ordonez. I don't know about the pronunciation. You don't care.
No.
You know that it's from heart, my heart, okay? So, I would just simply say Thomas. That's probably the easiest for all of us. So, he is actually right now working in the School of Humanities in a university in Bogota, which is called Universidad de Rosario. And he's actually an anthropologist. He was trained basically in the North American context, basically in Washington, and he actually got his degree, his PhD in Berkeley, medical anthropology, which is also probably kind of interesting maybe, not something very common at least in the Turkish context. Another important thing is he actually, as far as I talk, as I can see, he worked specifically on day laborers in California, basically coming from Guatemala, as far as I know,
Mexico,
and other parts. And you specifically are interested, obviously, in the interrelationship between migration, work, labor migration, but another very important issue is specifically this kind of the legal part, or the documentation actually also of migration. So in specifically the conceptualization and the discussions on undocumented migrant workers will be probably also an important discussion, or maybe an aspect of the discussion today. But in specifically, probably after you have turned back to Bogota, you started also specifically to work on refugee issues, which was kind of also speeded up probably with the large numbers of Venezuelan migration and refugees arriving in Colombia. And under these conditions, we probably have kind of more parallels maybe also with the case in Turkey. There have been also, as you actually told me, I had no idea about this, but there were actually also some attempts from the Turkish or certain state-supported institutions which actually came to Bogota in 2018, as far as I know, in the winter of 2018, to actually exchange, let's maybe call it like this, exchange experiences in relation to so-called refugees. Now, the concept of refugee in Turkey is very polluted, kind of. It's, I mean, there's a very proper legal definition, but there is a kind of a common sense definition of all our refugees, including the Syrian refugees. Now, we will probably have a talk about this later, but what is important, you probably from your experience with Colombia, with the Venezuelan migration crisis or humanitarian crisis, the concept of crisis itself will be probably also something to talk about and how far it is in itself or constructed. So, I mean, I think we will probably have more things in common and to exchange than it looks maybe in the first case. Because as far as I know, well, as far as I don't know actually, I mean, we are, at least I'm not a specialist on South America or Latin America, except a certain sympathy for certain, let's say, social political developments and accept the kind of a specifically very common, let's say, reading in the Middle East Technical University of the 1970s, 80s scholarship, which was very much inspired and specifically also by the Latin American schools. I'm not a specialist, but as I said, the migration issue and specifically the issue on labor migration could be probably very important and interesting to be discussed also here. So I'm sure there's much more to talk about. I know actually also, of course, a little bit about your, let's say, interested, or better to say how your interest kind of switched or concentrated now more intensively maybe on legal issues also. We talked about this yesterday. But I think you will open up all this in our discussion. And of course, if you have something importantly to be added to your CV, you're welcome. Otherwise, I think we would kind of first listen to you, but then maybe we will have also the chance to have some kind of really discussion. I mean, we will handle this all together, I think, in a kind of an interactive way.
Okay, well, thanks very much for coming to listen to me. Maybe I'll add a few things. If you're wondering about my accent, I'm one of very few people who grew up in an international community in Colombia. My mother's American, my father is Colombian. And this is important because until 2015, Colombia was really not a country with migrants. There were no foreigners in Colombia. There have been a small trickle of European and North American immigrants who had come to the country, settled in certain parts of the region. But as opposed to other countries in South America, Colombia has always been quite closed off to the rest of the world. Now I'm going to talk about that a little bit. Because I'm in Turkey and I don't know much about Turkish geography and history, I thought I'd start with just a simple map, right? So to understand where we're coming from, Colombia is at the top kind of most part of South America, and it's in a very strategic position because it has access to both the Atlantic Ocean and the Caribbean and the Pacific Ocean. And if you know anything about Colombia, we're kings of the drug trade, right? That has to do also with this position and with the geography of the country. I have another map further on. But other countries in the region have had a lot of migration in their history. And if you look at Brazil, Argentina, Peru, Chile a little bit, you'll see that they had, at some point or another, open doors policies to try to call immigrants in. This never happened in Colombia. I'll explain in a minute. So if we look just at simple kind of statistics, this is the, I guess in English is IOM, statistics before the crisis in 2015. Colombia was the first, or the nation with the greatest amount of immigrants, of people from Colombia living outside of Colombia. It was a country of emigration, not of immigration. And if you compare it to other places, it's quite significant. After 60 years, which is really 200 years of kind of civil war, fueled by the drug trade in the last couple of decades, Colombians had been leaving Colombia quite in big numbers. And although it's not that much of a proportion to the population, because it's a big country, it has 45 million people, it was the country in South America with the most amount of people living outside of its border. Venezuela, I guess I put it in the wrong place. I know it's right. Venezuela has a very different history, right? Venezuela is an oil-rich country. In the 1960s, 70s, 80s, thousands, hundreds of thousands of Colombians went to Venezuela to work in the oil industry. When I was little, we had a closed economy. There was no imported goods, right? And if you were cool, you were traveling to two places during the holidays. You were going either to Miami to buy Milky Ways and chocolates and all this American stuff, or you were going to Caracas, right? Those are the two places that people went to. Venezuela also had a lot of immigration from Spain and Italy in the 20th century, a lot of Spanish, I guess we would call them refugees from the Civil War. And in general, it was much more, let's say, of a vibrant kind of international type place than Colombia was. If we look at the history of migration to South America in general, there were large kind of transatlantic migrations to the region from Europe, mainly to Brazil, Argentina, later on in the 20th century, Peru, Chile. But in the 1960s, the trends kind of changed and people started leaving the region. And many factors affect this leaving the region. Depending on where you're standing, it can be because of economic crisis, it can be because of political turmoil. In Colombia, it's both. But it also has to do with migration regimes. right? How easy it is to go to migrate if you're a Latin American to another place. So if you're a Colombian and you were an adult traveling just as a tourist in the 1990s or even 15 years ago, it was very hard to get a visa anywhere, right? We were all drug traffickers. So it was kind of complicated. This means that in places like in the United States, Colombian immigrants tend to have higher education levels than other Latin American immigrants, right? Because it was people who had university degrees, who got jobs, and things like that. So just to kind of round it up, if we compare three very different countries, Colombia and Venezuela, which are stuck together, Venezuela had a huge influx of immigrants in the 20th century. It had open door policies, 1936 to 1958, but actually the open door policies lasted longer. It called a lot, I guess, it attracted a lot of immigrants from other parts of South America, and by 2011, Colombians living in Venezuela were the greatest population of foreigners in the country, right? Some statistics, the census, the last census they did said there were 700,000 Colombians living in Venezuela, but the truth of the matter is that they have no way of counting how many people were there for several reasons. One is the border between Venezuela and Colombia is very porous, so there's constant movement across it. Violence in Colombia pushed a lot of people across the border to Venezuela, so the border area, since before the crisis, was a problem of national security. But also, Chavez, the president before the current president, really liked to nationalize Colombians, right? He'd give them Venezuelan citizenship in exchange for votes. So if you get in a taxi in Cúcuta, which is the border town of Colombia, all the taxi drivers also have Venezuelan IDs, right? And they say, oh yeah, well, Chavez gave us these IDs. So it's very hard to know how many people there really was. And this is important because part of the crisis now has to do with differentiating between Venezuelan migrants and Colombian returnees, right? And it's very hard for the state to make that difference, but it's also very hard for the migrants themselves to understand what the difference means, right? Colombia has always been in this kind of tension since its independence between, originally it was a fight between kind of federalists who wanted a federal country with states that had their own constitutions, and centralists that wanted all the power to be concentrated in the capital in Bogota, which is in the middle of the country. This turned into a war between conservatives and liberals, and then it turned into the war that we're trying to get out of now. But what's important for migration there is that the elites did not want an influx of immigrants to change the political status quo. They actually purposefully limited the amount of immigrants that could come in. Before the Second World War and during the Second World War, we actually had explicitly racist immigration policies to keep refugees from Europe, specifically Jewish refugees and also Roma refugees, from entering Colombia, right? They've always been afraid that foreigners will change the political status quo, which actually happened in other places. So if you look at those countries and compare them to Argentina, Argentina actually at some point had more migrants per person or something than the United States. They had very robust open door policies. They actually paid for people to come to Argentina. In a very brief period of time, they went from 1.7 million people to 8 million people, and half of those people were immigrants. The statistics are very, very different. And if you look at those countries then, national identity is very different, right? Colombians are Colombian. They don't think of themselves as being the product of migration. They think of themselves as being the product of the mixture between indigenous Spanish and African people in the colonial period, but they don't really understand themselves as the product of migration, whereas migration is part of the national identity trope in other countries, like Argentina, to a lesser degree, Brazil. So this basically has resulted in migration studies and policies in this region to be concentrated towards south-north migrations, right? In Colombia, Colombia is a country of immigration, is very worried about all the Colombians living outside of Colombia. They want to keep contact with them. They want them to invest in the country. Remittances are very important for most of these nations. If you go to Central America, they're kind of, the whole economy is based on the money that people send back. And there's very little interest and very little knowledge about other types of migrations. South-South migrations are totally off the book. I went to a conference with people from Argentina and I said, well, what are you studying? And they said, oh, I study, people from Senegal in Argentina. And I said, there are people from Senegal in Argentina? It's a huge population, right? So there are other types of migrations into this region that are kind of not on the mind of the people who study migration and people who make migration policies. And then intra-regional migration, migration between the countries, is also kind of overshadowed, whereas it's been very important for many years, and in truth, in the last, let's say, 20 years, extra-regional migration, people leaving South America to other places, has gone down because migration regimes have become more stringent. So it's harder to migrate to the United States, to Canada, to Europe, whereas intra-regional migration, migration within countries in the region, has increased, right? So there's a lot of people moving between countries in the last years, and less people moving out of the region. And this is basically due to economic blocs and free trade agreements. And this is also important. Now these are the three main kind of alliances between countries. What this means is that the people that belong to those countries can freely move between those countries. As a Colombian citizen, I don't need a visa to go to Ecuador, Peru, or Bolivia, and I don't need a contract to get a resident permit, right? I can go there and move and look for a job for 2 years and nobody will ask what I'm doing. After 2 years, I have to produce some sort of contract that justifies me being there. So it's very easy to move between the countries. And although the one in the middle, the CAN, the Andean Community of Nations, Venezuela was a part of it and then went out, Venezuelans can also move more or less freely through most of these countries. There were no visa requirements for Venezuelans to come into Colombia. All you needed was a valid passport, you get a seal, and you can stay there for like 3 months, I think, 90 days. And so when we think about what's happening right now, maybe, I think I have some other graphs that might help you. We have to understand that what is a crisis is not that there are migrants all of a sudden in Colombia, but it's the amount of people that have come in a very short period of time. None of these things were prepared to take on, 2 million people crossing the border in 3 years. So just so we understand contemporary migration, this map here, that's all the things that are in green are territories that were at some point part of Colombia, right? So Venezuela and Ecuador were in the 19th century supposedly part of this great Colombia that the liberator Bolivar was going to make to kind of compete with the United States. And as the years went by, it went shrinking. But there are a lot of cultural and economic connections between these regions. This region down here is the Amazon basin, and that basically has been forgotten by the state until very recently, right? Nobody knows what goes on there. So Colombia, the Andes go into Colombia from the south, from Ecuador, and divide into 3 mountain ranges, and divide the country in those 3 mountain ranges, and most of the population lives on the mountains, right? Also on the Atlantic coast. And Venezuela has a very long border with Colombia, 2,200 kilometers, and at some point it was considered the most vibrant border in all of South America. The amount of people that crossed it every day, still it's like 60,000 people or 45,000 people a day cross this border. And again, this strategic position in Colombia has made it, a place where drug trafficking, gun trafficking, everything that can be trafficked through Colombia, because it's very hard to control this territory, right? We're talking about high mountain passes between that separate big kind of tropical areas and jungles. Colombia had the second oldest airline in the world. The minute they invented airplanes, we use them because building roads in this place is very crazy. And so there are other migration problems that people don't discuss so much, but that are also pretty bad. We're a big point in the migrant trafficking networks that bring people from Africa and Asia to the United States. And also people from Cuba come to Colombia to try to get into Mexico and cross the border. But in general, if we look at the statistics before the crisis, these are the amounts of people that were in Colombia in 2005 is the last thing. We can see that Venezuelans were the most prominent, but the numbers are ridiculous. 50,000 people, that's the people on the border, more or less, right? And the 3 or 4 Venezuelans who married Colombians and lived in Bogota. It's not a very big population. Not surprisingly, the next one is Ecuador, which is the other big border. And then Peru, which is it's kind of a Amazonian border, so it's not very important. And then in general, Venezuelans represented in 2010 the greatest amount of foreigners in the country, but this is even worse than the last one, 37,000 people. We had a lot of Americans because the United States paid for the drug war, and so there was a lot of American companies and American people working there, and also there are a lot of American-born Colombians who have no Colombian nationality. And then Ecuador, Spain sent a lot of people during the economic crisis, but the numbers were insignificant. What does this mean for the country? It means that this country had no immigration policy. It was thinking that migrants were probably people who were marrying into the upper class and coming to work in big industry, in the universities, but there was not an idea that there were going to be migrants anywhere in the country. When I moved back to Colombia in 2010, I was hired in my university as the anthropologist of migration, and I was like the department, I don't know, the mascot, right? Like, what does he do? Oh, he studies migration. Who does he study, right? In fact, there were other migrants there. I found, transnational indigenous musicians from Ecuador have been in Colombia for 100 years. But nobody really thought that I studied anything important. Now, all the universities have experts in migration. They're all political scientists, which means they don't talk to migrants. But it's a huge boom, right? That is changed only in 10 years. So if we want to get into the migrant problem in Colombia, we have to keep in mind that there were lots of Colombians in Venezuela, right? What happened? Colombia and Venezuela politically are on opposite ends of the spectrum, right? Venezuela is part of this socialism of the 21st century, and Colombia, the last 3 or 4, 5 or 6 Colombian governments have been more to the center and to the right. But there's a lot of animosity between the two countries. Historically, and in the last 2 decades, very kind of strong animosity politically. So in 2015, the president of Venezuela, for one reason or another, the border is totally politicized. So all the relations between the two countries play out on the border. He closed the border and deported 2,000 Colombian people who were on the Venezuelan side. Most of these people had refugee status because they were people who had been escaping violence from Colombia. By deporting these 2,000 people, he actually created a huge wave of Colombians crossing back into their country. More or less 20,000 people entered the country within a couple of weeks, right? And all concentrated on the border. So the first part of the migration crisis was not immigrants. It was what they call connationals, right? They even have a different term. They're not citizens, they're connationals. They're Colombians who are living abroad. And these kind of 20,000, more or less, people that came in, then obviously, when people migrate, they don't migrate just alone. I mean, people get married, people have children. So not all of them were Colombian citizens. Not all of them knew what Colombia was. I mean, there were lots of people who had been born in Venezuela, who arrived to the country, and it was a big, big problem. The Red Cross and the state kind of tried to organize programs to deal with these people, to kind of relocate them. But the truth of the matter is that most of those programs did not really work. And people just kind of organized themselves. The city of Cúcuta, which is on the border with Venezuela, has a lot of, I guess, what you would call shanty towns or favelas, kind of informal neighborhoods that have been built since 2015, where everybody is a Colombian who was from Venezuela, which means half the people are also Venezuelan citizens. Because the economy began to fail in Venezuela, along with those 2,000 people and the closed border, there started to be an increase in the amount of people that would cross into Colombia to buy food and to buy medication and things. And then some of those people started staying in the border areas. So the crisis started at the border. And another thing that you have to understand about Colombia is it's a centralized government up in the mountains, right? So politically, it doesn't look to its borders unless there are problems. And so they thought of it as a crisis on the border with Colombian citizens. But if you look at the statistics elsewhere, Venezuelans started leaving the country to many different places, right? They had actually started coming to Colombia before the crisis, but it was kind of the middle class, which people didn't notice as much. But by 2016, the number of people that were asking for asylum in the United States, which is the case and the asylum system I know best, had almost doubled, right? So there's a big outflow of Venezuelans starting in 2015. Now, again, Colombia had no migration policies. It had a very precarious kind of part of the state that dealt with migration, that was relatively new. It had been founded in 2011. And so we have the statistics of 2017 gathered by the IOM, right? And you can see the entrance to Colombia, went from 50,000 to 600,000 people in 2 years. But these numbers are all, I don't know, wishful thinking, right? Because this is only the people that they can count on the border who've sealed their passports. And this is the most porous border in all of South America. I mean, you can jump across it anywhere along the 2,000 kilometers, right? Now, well, there are mafias and there are gangs that control the borders and help you cross, but they had no way of counting the people who were crossing informally. So these statistics were generally doubled by anyone who was trying to realistically talk about migration 2 years ago, right? We were talking about more than 1 million people. And if you look at the other numbers, it's interesting. You can see that lots of people went back to Spain and Italy, and, well, not Portugal, not so much, but those are also people who were descendants of the migrants from the previous generations, right, who still had rights of citizenship in those countries. So, anyway, if we look at what happened in Colombia in 2015, Colombia is the main destination for most Venezuelans. Even today, the economy is so bad that there are very few international flights that leave Venezuela. So if somebody wants to go to Europe or go to the States, they still have to come into Colombia to take the plane. The first kind of waves of migrants were young people in their 20s, even younger. And very quickly, the country had to kind of sit down and try to figure out what was going on. And this is where Turkey comes in, and my interest for Turkey comes in. Because I guess I don't know really how the thing worked out. I read a couple of articles in the newspaper and talked to a few people who know, but the country started trying to answer this question. How are we going to deal with this problem? Are we going to talk about refugees? Right? Colombia has no asylum system. It signed all the international things, but I think until 2015 we had given 50 people in 30 years or 40 years asylum, right? The people we gave asylum to were the politicians that were escaping all these other regimes. There was no concept of refugee in Colombia. And in fact, the choice that was made was not to talk about refugees, right? So instead, they decided that they would offer a special permit to Venezuelans who would come in legally, have their passports sealed, and they'd give them a special immigration status, which they called the Special Permanence Permit, Permiso Especial de Permanencia. And it was designed to have them to legalize the status of these Venezuelans. I don't know what primary form of identification you use in Turkey, but in Latin America, most countries have an ID card, which we call a cédula, right? Which I'll be talking about in your class on Friday. The cédula has a number, and that number is your life, right? You give it when you get hired, you give it when you go into some buildings. You know, if it's a fancy building with high security, you have to show your cédula. The cédula is what you need to open a bank account, to get a cell phone, to get everything. And what happened to these people is they arrived in Colombia and they could not access any element of the state because they had no number. It was literally that stupid. They had no number to be registered anywhere. So the Permiso Especial de Permanencia was thought of as a way to legalize people and give them access to the state. But because they were thinking of the crisis on the border, they also made another type of ID card, which was a border mobility card, which was thought to help people go into the country to buy food and buy things and buy medical supplies, and then return to Venezuela. So they made this thing thinking this will ensure that people go home, right? Again, think of what I said before. Colombia has no migrants. We don't like migrants. We don't think of ourselves as a country of migrants. So in a way, the country was kind of, I think, making kind of band-aid solutions while it tried to figure out what it was going to do. There were discussions about calling them refugees and creating some sort of refugee status, but it was put under the table because of the amount of money that it would cost, right? And so they used kind of these 4 categories to understand migrants, always thinking of them in terms of economic migration, right? They were regular migrants who had crossed the border and had their passport stamped, irregular migrants who had crossed extra-officially, and then there were pendular migrants that go back and forth, and there were migrants in transit. And the transit now is a humanitarian crisis in itself. People are walking from Venezuela to Ecuador and dying on the highways of the country. I mean, it's a big problem. But until 2016, there was still no problem with migrants. There was just, we had problems on the border and nothing much is going to happen. If we look at the statistics that the government can produce with these kind of things, right, they still count Colombian returnees as part of the problem, but now they're talking about, this is until 2018, in September, 300,000 people, but they think that they've managed to regularize most of the people because they're all in these 2 categories, regularized and in the process of being regularized, and irregular migrants are a very small proportion, 105,000 people. Again, these statistics are very hard to believe if you work on the ground with the migrant populations. And my kind of slight comment about political scientists in Colombia has to do with that. There are very few people who are actually studying the migration problem from the perspective of migrants. They're all studying it from kind of state perspectives. But if you look at those 2 numbers I've circled, those are the 2 most difficult numbers to estimate. Everybody else, well, and actually the people in transit are also hard to know, but all the other people have in some form or another entered into the eye of the state. They have registered in some place, and so they can count them. But the returnees and the other irregular migrants are people that the state does not know how to count. So in a very quick timeline, in the last 4 years, this is what happened. First, there is a response to the Colombian returnees. We had a law of return that was developed because in 2008, all the countries in South America thought that everybody was going to come back because there was an economic crisis, and so they made all these wonderful laws so we would all go back. And so they kind of adapted that law to the Venezuelan case. Then in 2017, they made this special border mobility card, which very quickly they canceled because obviously what they did was create a way for people to become identified and have a number. So people used it to go into the country. And then they had two versions of this special entry, special permanence permit, which we're going to talk about a little more. And then in 2018, they decided to acknowledge the fact that they had no idea how many people were in the country, and so they promoted a census. We're going to have a census of all the Venezuelan migrants, and I'm going to talk about the problems with the census also, and hopefully we'll all agree that there's a migration crisis, right? So the mobility card is kind of weird. There's tens of thousands of people cross the border every day. It was only briefly issued, and yet they managed to issue 1,624,000 of them, right? But the cool thing is that it had a pre-registry part. So anybody in Venezuela could get on the internet and register to get a card, and would get kind of an email back with a little thing that you could print out, glue your picture on, and say to the authorities, well, I haven't had my tarjeta issued yet, but I already registered, right? So they created kind of an informal form of identification. And again, Colombian authorities want to see a number, a picture and a number. That's what they want to see. And so I've never actually met anybody who has the real card. I've met hundreds of people who have that pre-registry. And one of my interests is kind of the social life of documents, the way that, you know, people who have no access to documentation start to relate to the state through other types of documents. And in the end, the country, the state, the government decided to cancel this, so although it's still valid, I mean, they can still use it at the border, they're not issuing it anymore. So this special permanence permit, or whatever, again, depended on people having their passport sealed. So we have the problem with the porous border, but we also have problems with the Venezuelan government. And that is, it is impossible to get a passport in Venezuela today, right? You have to pay hundreds of dollars in bribes to get a passport, and even with the bribes, it's not likely that you'll get one. So fortunately, before Chavez died, in 2013, he had a program in which he gave people dollars at a very low rate so they could travel all over Latin America. So lots of people have a passport from that time, and those passports are starting to expire now. But so this special permanence permit, or whatever you call it in English, is really designed only for people who had passports and crossed the legal border. And the droves of people that have crossed informally had no access to it. And no access means there was no way that they could get regularized in one way or another. And they did this twice, right? They changed the dates. The government doesn't want to create a policy that will attract more people, so they use cutoff dates. They say until the 28th of July 2017, anybody who entered legally can get one of these permits. And then so many people did it that they extended it. Anybody who came in until the 2nd of February of 2018 legally with a seal, and I wrote el sello there because it's kind of a mantra among migrants. Do you have the seal? Do you not have the seal? Having the seal from the border is important, and actually now they're mafias. You can send your passport to the border and pay certain bribes, and they'll, you know, get the seal for you. And so people are waiting for them to do a new one to have their seals made. And then, even for those people who got the PEP, it didn't solve many of the problems, because that number that we all have, I don't know how many numbers it has, 10. The PEP had 15 numbers. So if you wanted to open a bank account, the bank system would not take your number. If you wanted to go to a hospital, the hospital system would not take your number. So I have a collection of decrees of the government telling the Ministry of Health, you have to change your system so people with the PEP can sign into the thing. Telling the financial sector, you have to change your systems so this number can fit in the thing. But, I mean, I don't know if any of you know, but the amount of money it would cost to just change that in some of these institutions. I mean, the institutions did not know how to respond to this. So even with the PEP, there were still people who could not have cell phones, who could not have a bank account, who cannot have all the basic things actually that you need in order to get a job. You can't get a job in Colombia if you don't have a bank account, because you need to show that you, I don't know, can get paid. The other problem is they made the validation of degrees, like university degrees, so hard that even if you had the PEP, you still couldn't be hired to work in in your profession, because it would take you a year, if you were lucky, to get your degree validated. I've been in Colombia for 10 years and have a degree from a pretty well-known university, and I still haven't been able to get my degree validated, right? So I work in a private university, which doesn't care. But anyway, so the number doesn't fit, and here's, you know, what my main interest. I have this fetish with documents because I have a lot of them. I have 2 nationalities, but the fact that the number doesn't fit is something that any migrant can tell you is the central part of their life. And if you tell somebody in the government, they say, oh no, well, we've already solved all these problems. Those problems were small glitches, but even my university still does not have in their system enough spaces for people to put their number in to get a master's program, right? They have to write the university and explain that their immigration status is this special thing. So many people still were not regularized that they decided to do the census. And this census is maybe a very unfair thing, I think. I was very kind of mad about how they did it. But people were explicitly told that this census was not going to lead to any element of citizenship. That the government just wanted to know how many people were in the country and wanted to know their needs so they could develop public policy, but that this census would not lead anywhere, right? And then with the UNHCR and the IOM, they put different points in the country, so people would go to the census, and they started flooding Facebook and social media with information about it. But not all the places where they put those points were important places for migrants, and many migrants living in the big cities or out in the countryside didn't know exactly what points to go to. And so it's been sold as a great thing, this census, but I don't think that it really tells us much about how many people were in. The other thing is that by this point, all the humanitarian organizations, the Red Cross, all the religious NGOs and nonprofit organizations were also doing registries to try to understand the population that they were serving, right? So there were, in Bogota, there were like 6 different registries going on for Venezuelan migrants, other than the state registry. So there are lots of people that don't know if they're registered or not. And this is important because 2 weeks after they closed the census, the government said, okay, we'll give a new version of the PEP, of the permit, to all the people who registered in the census, right? And then all the people who didn't register got very mad because they were told that it wasn't going to lead there. The other interesting thing about the census is that to be able to register, you had to have your birth certificate, you had to have a whole bunch of papers. So for example, in my family, if I had gotten a job, I would have sent my wife to register us. And she might have been able to register herself and our older son, or our younger son who was born in Colombia, but she wouldn't have had all the papers to register me or my older son who was born abroad, which means that the government inadvertently created mixed status families, right? There are lots of families that have members who have PEP and members who don't have PEP, right? So what is the kind of picture that I'm trying to paint? Right now, the statistics say that we have 1,300,000 Venezuelan migrants. Obviously, as I say, I don't think that they can count them. So it's probably much more. Of those people, there is a huge proportion of people that have no access to any type of social service. They have only access to emergency health care if they don't have this registry, and in some cases to education for their children, because there's constitutionally, all children have a right to be educated in Colombia, but if they don't have the right papers from Venezuela, they can go to school, but the school will never certify that they were there. because they can't guarantee that they, you know, the 4th grade in Venezuela and 5th grade in Colombia. There's a huge problem with women who get pregnant or who come to the country pregnant, because being able to go to the emergency room is not enough for these women, and so there's huge problems in which, you know, they have to invent lies. I've been in meetings where they kind of teach each other what types of lies you can say in the emergency room that will result in the right types of exams to see that your baby's okay. The pictures that I'm going to show you now, just to kind of finish up, kind of represent the experience of migrants in Colombia, waiting in long lines. This is a wait for a soup kitchen where they give people just lunch. I worked there for 6 months last year, and during the time that I was there with my students, 3 babies died of the people who were standing in line because they couldn't take them to the hospital. This is on the border with Venezuela. There's thousands and thousands of people everywhere, just standing around waiting in line, waiting to get into some place where they can get food. And this is maybe my favorite line. The city of Bogota labor institution, the part of the city that, you know, promotes jobs and makes labor fairs and things, had this wonderful idea that they would do a labor fair for Venezuelan migrants. And you can't see it in the picture, but they did it right in front of the battalion, the army battalion that protects the president, right? Because if you go to one of these fairs on a normal day, only 3 people in a city of 8 million would actually believe that the city can get you a job. I mean, everybody knows that it's all kind of empty, right? But they promoted it for Venezuelans, and like 700 people appeared. They were obviously the poor soldiers in the battalion in front, thought that there was some sort of an invasion, they were going to kill the president. They had to move everybody out, and you can't see the line, but this line is like 5 blocks long. I stood in it for a whole day. We never got anywhere near to where it was, and that was only for people who had PEC, right? It was only for people who had the permit, because PEC allows you to work. So in the experience of most migrants in Colombia, none of these things have actually resulted in anything, right? Only in frustration, and kind of there's this, which is something that I'm studying right now, there's this kind of, they're all waiting for the state, right? They're longing for the state to appear and do something. And they kind of are very patient people. I've never seen a fight in one of these lines. If you put Colombians in a line, there'll be a fight in 20 minutes, right? Then, if they do get into places, this is the labor thing that was promoted. This is, we're not going to read this, but this is a wonderful little notice that was put on in a small town on the outskirts of Bogota, which was telling Venezuelans that the census A would not result, over here, it will not result in any type of migration status, and B, it was telling them, this town is not going to do that, you have to go to the next town. Right? And so when I was there and talking to the people, I was saying, well, are you going to go to the next town? Well, what for? Why would I, you know, I have to take a day off work, I'll have to leave my children alone in the house, why should I go to the next town? And then, as an anthropologist that studied something that nobody cared about, and now everybody is studying this thing, I've had kind of trouble trying to decide what it is I'm going to do. And I worked with another colleague who used to work with Colombian migrants in Venezuela, and he knows all the kind of informal humanitarian services, right? The churches that offer people food, and it turns out that those institutions now need to produce registries of how many people they're feeding and how many people go to their services. So I found a wonderful niche as an anthropologist. I take armies of students to different parts of the city to help make the registries for these organizations in exchange for some information, but as an excuse to talk to people. And I've spent the last year kind of jumping from one part of the city to another, and in a morning we can register 200 people that represent probably 700 people in total, because we do their families. Very few of them have PEP, right? They're all irregular migrants. The other element is that this law of return for Colombian migrants coming back assumes that a retournee is somebody who left Colombia, lived for a certain amount of years in Venezuela and came back. But it doesn't consider that people have children. And in Colombia you have rights of citizenship if your parents were Colombian, even if you were born abroad, right? So I've worked with lots of different people who, I've known for months, and Venezuelan migrants, and then one day we're having coffee and they say, well, my mother was Colombian. And I say, well, let's go to the registrar's office. Do you have her birth certificate? No, right? So there are lots of these people who actually have rights of citizenship in Colombia. And it's very hard for them to get it. And if they get it, still it's very hard for them to not be scripted as Venezuelans. And so for the last kind of part of my presentation, this is now a very typical site in Bogota. This is the public transport system, which is disastrous. And there are hundreds of Venezuelans. They get on. The hyperinflation in Venezuela last year, I think, was 1,300,000%. So they get on with bags full of bills and kind of exchange their bills. They tell a sob story, they call it La Llorona, and they exchange their bills for Colombian pesos. But also, the migration problem has become politicized in many ways. So last year we had presidential elections, and the country was kind of full of this type of publicity. This is on the border. It says, the tragedy of Venezuela is the result of a socialist government. Vote well, vote for Duque, who is on the right. And this was in Bogota, and it says, so Colombia won't become another Venezuela, vote for Duque. What this means for migrants is that, on the one hand, the way that they're being treated in the country is kind of schizophrenic, right? The government promotes fraternity. It talks about their brothers, our Venezuelan brothers, or our brothers and sisters. But on the other side, there's a lot of distrust towards Venezuelans. Crime rates have gone up in some parts of the country, and so there's a lot of distrust because they're considered criminal. But during the elections, then these guys on the buses changed their sob story a little bit. And it was no longer, we have no money to buy food, we have no money to buy rice. It's, let me tell you what happened to my country. Let me show you what we did wrong, and then you stop. It was very successful. This paper here doesn't mean anything, but it's somebody's receipt from sending money home. And after a week working on Transmilenio, they managed to send home 2 years of minimum salary back to Venezuela. 140,000 pesos, or 60,000 pesos, which is, I guess you can buy the same as 160 Turkish lira, more or less, right? It was 40 million bolivares. And so there's a lot of kind of schizophrenia in the way that the country deals with the problem of migration. There's a lot of xenophobia, or a lot of kind of discrimination in labor. It's very clear. One would only hire a Venezuelan to exploit them, for example. This is something that is very common. The labor laws in Colombia are so good that nobody can follow them, right? If you follow the labor law, you basically go bankrupt. So there's a lot of informal labor, and Venezuelans get the short end of the stick. But also then there's, places popping up everywhere. There's a lot of kind of distrust about the impact the Venezuelans are having on the country. These pictures are from the border area. This is right on the border. I was doing these things here in the churches in Bogota, and we were doing 200 families maybe in the morning, and we went to one in Cúcuta on the border, and we were trying to measure pendular migration, this thing that the government thinks they understand perfectly well. And this place has 3,000 people a day who come and have breakfast there. And some of those people were walking 6 hours from Venezuela to Cúcuta to have breakfast and then go back. And we thought we understood it perfectly well. And then my colleague went to a project on the Ecuadorian side, which is on the other side of the country, a month later, and he bumped into all these people that we had met in the place on the border that were supposed to be pendular migrants that were going back to Venezuela. And then funny things are happening in Colombia. Like, you can get on a bus and pay a ticket to that will take you on a bus to Argentina, which is like 50 or 60 hours on a bus. I mean, it's a very strange kind of reconfiguration of the things. This is one of these informal neighborhoods on the border, and the state has had programs. The international humanitarian organizations have done a lot of programs here because all the families are returnees. But if you go into one of these houses and talk, it's not true, right? Some are just one person who has a Colombian citizenship, and all the rest of the family are I mean, they include in the census their neighbors and their bosses. I mean, they brought everybody they knew that they were close to back across. And then the other thing that's interesting, I like this picture because the guy is hiding his Venezuelan cedula, right? There's this very kind of gray area with people like me who are dual nationals, because in theory they should be acting and behaving in the country as Colombian citizens, right? But because of the way they speak and because, you know, the way they live, they're always scripted as Venezuelans. So there's this thing about you carry one paper in one pocket and the other in the other, and then you go have lunch at the place where they're giving lunch for Venezuelans with your Venezuelan cedula. But if the police stops you for selling stuff on the street, you take your Colombian one out, and then they get on the bus and they show both and say they're being exploited with both of them. But so there's a lot of, I mean, there's a lot of kind of, there are many gray areas. That's just the airport in Cucuta. It lists all these currencies as if you could actually really buy an Antillean florin. In a little city in Colombia, they only sell dollars. But the Bolivar, the Venezuelan currency doesn't even appear because it changes from one hour to another, right? And finally, this kind of theme of trying to construct Venezuelans as our brothers, that we have to help, this kind of solidarity discourse is really a very kind of complex process. This is the main soda pop in Colombia. It's called Colombian, right? And they have a special edition which they changed the name to Brothers, to Hermanos, right? So there's a lot of this kind of outward kind of patting yourself on the shoulder discourse that we're really treating our brothers well. But as you know, you can also have brothers who become drug addicts and thieves and things like that, and there's also the black sheep of the family. And so you see these things kind of playing out a bit in political discourse. And then the access to most of these things that the government says it's doing is completely limited. So this was sent to me by somebody in Cucuta. It's a sign on the bus terminal in Cucuta last year, and it's telling people that they cannot board a bus to leave the city without their Colombian ID card, an ID, the equivalent for a legal foreigner, which is a cédula extranjería, a child's ID card, a passport, or civil registry, your birth certificate, right? They won't sell any bus tickets to Venezuelans with no documents. Obviously, that's what it says there in that office. But if you walk 2 blocks away, the same bus is stopping, and for double the price, they'll let you on without any papers, and you have to lie in the corridor of the bus when the police stop you, right? So there's kind of this weird schizophrenic thing. This is a wonderful picture also on the border. It's actually the information booth of one of these international organizations that is helping supposedly people understand their legal situation. And there's a sign that says, there's no information, don't insist, right? And I think that that's probably the most honest sign I've seen in Colombia. At least it's honest. So I guess what I'm trying to say with this presentation is there is a migration crisis in Colombia, and it's very strange the way it's being framed, right? There is no longer any talk about actually trying to create some sort of way to recognize the amount of people that are in the country and offer them all help in one way or another. There's always kind of a theory of regularizing people who are more deserving than others. I don't know really exactly what the idea is. The way that it's being done has created a whole bunch of gray areas. There are lots of people who don't know what's going on, who don't understand what types of things they have access to or not. And at the same time, political discourse is trying to kind of balance this image of fraternity, but also Venezuelans are communists, Venezuelans are criminals. I haven't gone into it. It's a much more complex story, but you know, the armed actors on the border are still present, and so there's the preoccupation that they're going to recruit Venezuelans into the guerrillas, which is also kind of a silly thing. And at the same time, and just to finish, one of the weirdest things throughout this whole thing is kind of the ties that lots of these policies have to Turkish policies, right? There was a lot of interest a couple of years ago in Colombia in how Turkey had dealt with Syrian migration, and the government kind of was in the newspapers, it's not a big secret, was sending people to Turkey to understand what was happening, and then people from Turkey came to Colombia to explain how the system worked. But this kind of special permanence permit that leads nowhere, right? You can have it, but it won't ever turn into legal residency. It's kind of this, I don't know, limbo status. It lasts 2 years. Is I think designed in one way or another, you know, inspired in a lot of the policies here. So that's my presentation.
Well, I don't know whether I'm the moderator. Okay, I'm the moderator. Whether we can actually do it jointly. So probably there are maybe some comments, some questions, maybe first some questions, maybe for clarification maybe, or maybe we can already directly delve into some more, let's say, more discussion points or arguments. I mean, so the floor is actually up to you. Right? So maybe we just start out with some questions, some comments. So I don't know. Yeah, we go. Well, I actually saw him first, then I saw Hilal, then I saw you. Maybe you can first start out like this. I don't know your name. I'm sorry.
First of all, I'd like to thank you for your presentation. I think it's very beneficial for us. And I'm wondering if can you make any comments on the Venezuelan people in your country and the labor market response? So,
and the what?
Labor market response. So I would be very appreciated if you can comment on these issues.
So maybe we connect the first 3 questions and then you can reflect.
Thank you very much. This Colombia as a country is interesting for me. In my study area, this is a kind of paradox country because this is one of the happiest regions in the world. So when you examine the happiness rankings in the world, after the Nordic countries, Latin American countries are the happiest ones, and Colombia is the most happiest one. And that's why when I talked with the colleague from the Colombia, we were just laughing that okay, these people are good with marijuana and then sing and dance and then they are happy. But I'm really wondering about that after this refugee crisis or migration, how this social structure and also the demographic structure of the Colombian country change, and then whether it really reflects on the happiness and rich well-being level of the population. I know this is a little bit speculative question, but it is really interesting to think about the link between this migration problem and the well-being in this context as well.
There was one more person.
Yeah, I have a question. Thanks for the presentation. This is Selma from Turkish Red Crescent, actually. I wondered what is the reaction of the international community to Colombia? How is the activities of UN agencies and other international NGOs? If you can, thank you.
Well, maybe we first start out.
Good, so maybe I'll start with the happiness index, but before I answer, I'll clarify. I'm an anthropologist, and I work with migrants. So I can give you the perspective of the migrants. I've been approached by a lot of international organizations, but we don't seem to speak the same language. So take what I answer with a grain of salt. In terms of the happiness index, I don't know. In Colombia, we don't understand who the hell they asked. It's a running gag in Colombia too, right? The usual trope is they must have gone to the coast where everybody's lazy and drunk. But what's interesting about it is, and maybe I should have included it in the presentation, I mean, Colombia is just emerging from 60 years of internal conflict. And it's not really emerging very well. Our current government is trying to go back on the peace accords, and it's doing very stupid things, in my perspective, because the changes have been radical. Even as a professor in a university for 10 years, I've taken my students on field trips to part of the country that in 40 years that I've been alive, I'd never been in, because through the peace process, a lot of the country opened up to us. So the interesting question about the happiness index is not the Venezuelan crisis, is why we're the happiest country in the world if we have the oldest guerrilla war in the world. We're in the middle of the drug war, and we're governed by corruption, right? So I don't know how you would answer that. In terms of kind of the demographic impact, I don't think they're even thinking about that right now. It was kind of weird. Last year the national census data came out, and the census institution, I don't know how you'd call it, was freaking out because it turned out we had less people than they were estimating for all their calculations to develop public policy, and they were missing like 3 million people, and they were wondering what the hell they were going to do. And we were all saying, well, we have, 2 million immigrants, right? If you're missing them, why don't you just give them, citizenship? I mean, it's not like they need to learn the language or the culture, it's the same thing, right? But the truth of the matter is that I think that they have very obtuse ideas about what the impact is going to be. My preoccupation with this special permanence permit is that if the government in Venezuela changes, right, if they oust the president or if they do something, the Colombian government is going to say, oh, okay, no more need for this special permit. Everybody go home. Because there is an attitude that everybody will go home after the problems are over. And for anybody who studies migration, that's absurd. People don't move their lives, they don't establish themselves, kill themselves in a place, to get a place to live, to send their kids to school, to just go home the day after the thing that they imagine is going to make them go back happens. But again, we're talking about maybe 2 million people in a country of 47 million people. So it really, the question should be answered regionally, right? There's some regions that are having an influx that is higher than others. And in terms of the labor market, well, that's also a very difficult question to answer. Like the city of Cúcuta, where I showed you pictures, the rate of informal work there is like 75%. So even for Colombians, right, it's a complicated situation. Most of the people who I'm talking about, were people that don't have documents, are working in the informal market, and basically that means they're selling things on the street. There are these centers, like these markets, where all the produce that comes into the city gets centralized and then taken out to the supermarkets and stuff. And all the people there who carry the potatoes are Venezuelans. And what I know is that, I don't know any of these migrants who get paid the wage that they should get paid. Even in the informal market, they're being kind of exploited. So there are lots of preoccupations that they're going to make unfair competition, but I mean, as I say, it's very hard to establish when the rate of informality is so big. Anyway, there's a lot of conflict between Colombians and Venezuelans in that sense. I don't know if that answers.
Basically, the street sellers?
Street sellers and
other sectors, are there any kind of more specific sectors?
Construction. And then in Colombia, it's still very common for people to have maids in their house, people like domestic labor. And those cases are some of the most violent ones, right? Because people, have live-in maids. The opportunities for exploitation there are less visible outwardly, and so there are big things there. And then, I mean, I don't know if this is part of the labor problem, but prostitution in a city like Bogota has become almost uniquely Venezuelan, right? And that is a very complicated problem because in many of the cases, actually one of the pictures I showed you is right on the other side of the street of what they call tolerance zones, which is where all the prostitutes are. And working there, sometimes the police would come in and take people out, and all the people would cross the street to make the line to have lunch while the police was leaving. But most of the women who were working there had had their papers taken away from them. So there's a lot of kind of, and that's not only in Bogota, that's on the border, that's everywhere. It's a big problem. And then I think the problem with the children is probably the greatest kind of question mark we have. And in terms of international cooperation, yes, I mean, there's a lot of international cooperation, but it works in funny ways. So for example, because of the violence in Colombia before the crisis, there were a lot of things already in place to respond to internal displacement, right? And on the border, there were a lot of internally displaced people. So on the border, there was the Norwegian Council for Refugees, the Red Cross. They all had things already in place, and they very quickly were able to respond to kind of immediate problems, right? Like people getting there and feeding people, helping them with healthcare. But in the inside of the country, there was nothing, right? Some of these places, like the Jesuit refugee, I don't know their names in English. Their main office was in Bogota, but they had no programs in Bogota, right? And all of a sudden people started knocking on their door asking for things, and so they had to reorganize. My perception as a person that's not part of this world is they're all kind of doing the same thing, right? So I've been asked to do characterizations or baselines of the migrant population in, and I talked to my friend who's also does and he's doing the same thing, right? So they're all doing kind of the same thing, the access routes. But in many cases, although I think that the work is very well intended, it's not really, I don't feel that it's really dealing with the problem on the scale of the country, right? It's concentrated in the border, both border with Venezuela and border with Ecuador, because there's a huge problem with people crossing into Ecuador, and if a Venezuelan kills somebody in Ecuador, then Ecuador changes its policy and everybody gets stuck on the border. That happened a couple of months ago. And then inside in the big cities, I see it more as things like the local churches of all religions are kind of dealing with the programs. The Archdiocese of Bogota has kind of the most realistic program I've seen, which they don't ask people for their papers. Like some of the places on the border, you actually have to show certain types of papers, and if you don't have them, you can't go. That's another thing. If you're a Venezuelan and they steal your wallet, there's no way that you can get another ID card, and so you cannot identify either to the Colombian government or to the agencies that want to offer help, right? So I think the thing is well in place, but I'm kind of skeptical as to how they're really dealing inside the country with the problem. And there's another kind of weird problem that nobody's really dealing with, and it is, I don't know how you say it, Colombia has no jus solis law. If you're born in Colombia and your parents are illegal, you are not a Colombian national. And Colombia has signed all the things against stateless people, right? But all the Venezuelan children that are being born are getting birth certificates that have a little thing on the bottom that says this is not valid for citizenship. And then they assume that if the people go back to Venezuela, Venezuela will give those guys nationality. But in practice, there's no way to get those children documents in Colombia. I have an article that was published in the newspaper, which looks like a chapter out of a Kafka book, right? This is how you would have to get a child Colombian nationality. You'd have to prove that he's stateless, and it's a bureaucratic problem And for example, I don't see anybody trying to deal with this issue, that they can't get the kids Venezuelan citizenship or Venezuelan birth certificates, and those children now are in Colombia and they have papers that say that they're alive, but that give no nationality. Nobody's thinking about that. And in one of these lines, I'd say that half the children under 2 years of age were born in Colombia in that situation.
Thank you, Juan. My name is Madeline. I'm also working for Turkish Red Crescent. Actually, my question was, you're touching upon it a bit before, is on youth. So the Venezuelans who are in Colombia, do you have information as to what the Colombian government is doing to continue their education? Where is that at? What kind of services are being given? Are they being given? Thank you.
Yes, I can tell you what I know from the places where I've worked. So in Colombia, there's a law that says all children have a right to education. And the way it works on the ground, like the people who work in the Secretariat of Education in Bogota, they're wonderful people, right? They're all kind of left-wing, they're very practical, and they know that, and they want to do it. But things like this happen. I worked in a little town outside of Bogota. Everybody has a right to education, but there is not a school big enough for all the children that are living in the area, right? So it's a first come, first served basis. If your parents went and registered you, you can do it. If not, you have to go to the next town, but people don't go to the next town. And that happens in the city also. So if you go to the school near where you live and it's already been filled out, you might have the right to education, but they'll tell you, well, you have to send your kids to the next neighborhood. And I don't know how traffic is about here because I only got here at night, but the next neighborhood could be an hour and a half away by bus, right? It takes forever to move around in Bogota. So there's one issue. The other issue, which I think they were trying to solve, but I don't know if they have, what I've heard on the street is they haven't, is this issue with validation. So if you are a teenager in high school and you left Venezuela and you want to continue your education in Colombia, then you have to show the school what grade you were in Venezuela. And if you don't have the right papers, first you had to have an apostille on the papers. There are no apostilles in Venezuela, you have to bribe somebody. So if you don't have the right papers, then you can register in school and you can go to school and you can learn, but the school won't validate that you were there. So it won't certify the degree. That was, last year that was a big problem. I think they have already solved it, but from what I hear on the street, many people still don't know if they're going to get this kind of paper done or not. There's another problem, and it is that there are a lot of kids that aren't in school because the parents can't send them. And by law, the Colombian Institute for Family Beneficence, or whatever, I don't know, for the Colombian Institute that protects children, at the beginning was not kind of bothering people. They weren't, stopping mothers who were working on the street with children to say, hey, why aren't your kids in school? Because in theory, that they should take the kids away from the mothers and put them in homes. And but there was kind of a not very explicit policy not to bug them because they didn't want to create kind of a Trump-like problem with separating children from their families. But I don't see a resolution to that kind of really acting out. One thing that's beginning to happen is Venezuelan youth is becoming criminalized. This is already in place in Colombia. I mean, poor youth is already criminalized by where a person comes from, how they speak, how they look. They're assumed to be criminals in many situations. And with the Venezuelans, you can see it, these guys that work on the bus, they get, sometimes people at the beginning were very nice and gave them money, but now they get screamed at and they get accused. Anything that gets stolen on the bus, it was a Venezuelan. And so there are lots of problems with that, and youth, I think, is suffering more than most. And finally, well, yeah, I mean, the health issues are the worst ones because, again, every child in Colombia has a right to health, but the bureaucratic holes in which they get lost are terrible. So in one of those sessions where we were signing people up, one of my students called me because the lady who was there giving her information, her daughter had been burnt in a fire in Venezuela and had skin grafts on her head and supposedly needed, to be seen by a doctor every 2 weeks or something like that, and hadn't been to the doctor in a year, because when she went to the emergency room, they said, well, that's not an emergency. That's something that is long-term, right? And if that's an extreme case, you can go back and, people don't have access to the dentist. So I don't know if I answered your question.
Yeah, thank you.
Are there other questions? Maybe please.
My name is Kıvanç. I study in Latin American department. My question is, don't you think it would be a better idea to accept Nicolas Maduro as a refugee rather than host the site of Venezuela?
So, that's what my father says. My father says Colombia only needs to recognize one refugee, right? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah,
to have Maduro,
and that's it.
And it would solve the problem. Yeah, you and my father would get along very well. I think the problem is bigger than that, though. At this point, I think that changing the government, will change certain things, but it won't necessarily solve all the problems with the migrants in Colombia. But this problem is much greater. It goes down into Ecuador and Peru, and different things are happening there that have effects back into Colombia and Venezuela. And I think that won't go away for a good while, even if they accept Maduro as refugee.
Oh, thank you so much. Actually, it is very hard to say. It was such a good, presentation when the situation is so tragic. But I really enjoyed it. Thank you very much, and I've learned a lot. Although, depending on your presentation too, we laughed maybe, because it is. Everything sounds so irrational, actually, but it happens on Earth, as we all know. So therefore, thank you very much again. But when we come to this point of co-nationals, or the diversity and the differentiation of the status of those migrants, and also that regarding these situations, the only solutions, if I understood you correctly, is to be able to have that documents of what was named special permanent permit or something like that. Therefore, it came to my mind that there must be another kind of trafficking. Not trafficking, but just there is a source of illegality over there. Is it possible to produce all these documents illegally, and is there networking over there?
That's a wonderful question, but it's very hard to answer. Like, my first experience with undocumented migrants was in the United States, where there's a huge market for counterfeit documents, and some that are not really counterfeit, but you buy somebody else's number and stuff like that. The way that the Colombian state works makes it very difficult for you to actually be able to have a fake document and then not to realize, because it's a national registry. They have to kind of invent you in the system, because when you go to the hospital and these things, it wouldn't work. So I haven't seen actually a lot of fake documents. For example, to get the PEP, if you were in the registry, the system itself gave you a number when you registered, and then it says everybody who has a number between these numbers can come and try to get their thing. So there'd be no use into what's happening. It has to do with labor. There's a lot of kind of illegal labor recruitment things that tell people that they're going to get them papers, and that that if you work in this construction site for 2 months, we'll get you papers, and then they work and they don't get paid and they don't get papers. So what there is a lot of, and this also creates a lot of problems, is there's a law in Colombia that says that if you were born in a rural area and your parents couldn't register you when you were born, to be registered, all you need is 2 witnesses to your birth, right? And I studied this when I studied the indigenous migrants. So it's not so difficult for you to find, an uncle and a relative that go and say, oh, this child was born in Colombia and you can get a registry. And people have been doing that on the border areas for decades, at least since the 70s when this law came out. And what happens is that people think that because they're lying, they should change their name, right? And then funny things happen. Like I met a woman on the Transmilenio on the bus, and she was born in Venezuela. Both her parents were Colombians. And one of her mother was still alive, so it'd be relatively easy to get her Colombian citizenship. But they took her back to their town when she was a child and registered her as being born in Colombia. They didn't know that she could be a dual national. And since they were lying, well, they changed her last name. And so she has a Colombian birth certificate with one last name and a Venezuelan birth certificate with another last name. And she has 3 children, right? So if she uses her Colombian registry, she is no longer legally the mother of her children, and her children will be removed from her care, right? And so a lot of this is the type of kind of informal documentation that I've seen that is more common. But in terms of like fake cédulas and fake PEP numbers, it might work. I mean, people use silly things to identify to the police. That thing up there is one of those things that you go when you go to a bank and you take a number. And Migración Colombia is the migration agency. But that person I got that from, he had been to a meeting, he got stopped on the street for selling stuff, and they said go to the migration agency, and they just took his name and asked him where he was from. He's illegal, but he kept his number from standing in line. And when he gets stopped by the police, he shows them the number. He says, oh, I've already been to the migration. You know, here's my number. They're dealing with my case. And that's how he avoids getting arrested. And I've actually studied, I mean, Venezuelans, in Colombia it's not very common, like lawyers and journalists have to have a professional card that says you're a lawyer, right? But anthropologists, nobody cares, so we don't have a card. But in Venezuela, everybody has to have a card that says you are whatever. And so they use those cards as forms of identification, and it works with the police don't know what to do, right? The police have to stop these people, they take away all their wares, their food and stuff like that, and in theory, if they don't have papers, they should take them to migration, but there's so many of them that if they have these cards, they use that. So that type of thing is more common than fake documents.
Okay. Other questions or comments?
One more question. What do you think, what has your government learned from Turkey?
What the government learned from Turkey?
What do you think that they have
Don't trust
learned
elections.
from Turkey?
Well, that's a question I hope to answer later on. What I've seen is, for example, that this permiso especial de permanencia is really modeled after some of the Turkish policies. I don't know the names, I've just begun to read about it, that they have with temporary migration here. And I was kind of dumbfounded when I realized that there were these connections, and actually they're very open. I mean, some of these people from, I can't remember what organizations they were from, came to talk in one of my classes. No, the translator was from TICA, but these other people, the Colombian government was really looking for solutions to not recognizing a refugee status that would encompass everybody that was there. The Colombian government is very reticent to offer help to everybody. They want to be able to say yes to some and no to the other. And they're totally obsessed with calling more people. They call it the efecto llamada, the call effect, right? With creating some sort of policy that will make people want to cross over more. And so, from what I've been able to gather from reading about the Syrian case, I think these policies were actually kind of informed by some of the Turkish policies. Also, they at some point thought about making refugee camps in Colombia, and then they came here and looked at the refugee camps here, and that was in the news, and that was very scary because refugee camps between countries like Venezuela and Colombia would not go down well in history.
Camps usually don't, right?
No, they don't.
But I mean, well, I don't know. Do you have other questions?
One small question related with the last question. I think what is most tragic about Colombia, the Venezuelan refugees, about access to healthcare services. Because in Turkey, with Syrian migrants, I think that this access to health care services is the mostly developed policy. Because without any cards, without any ID cards, like temporary protection status or whatever, if you say that, like when you go to state hospital, then you need a health care, then you can get this service without free of charge.
Yeah.
So, do you think that this can be a kind of a model for the Colombia for the healthcare, because especially for the pregnancy issues, and also the due to war, we had much more, of course, severe injuries and need more health care. But I think the situation is a little bit different in Colombia. But do you think that it can be a model for Colombia?
Healthcare in Colombia, we have a universal healthcare system which bankrupt all doctors. Doctors hate it. Doctors are no longer rich, no longer have status. And the Colombian, there's some very strange attitudes about the healthcare system in Colombia. So there's an idea that the migrants are going to kind of implode the system. Before the crisis, I worked with the Ecuadorian migrants, and the second in command, not the ambassador, but the
Consul. Consul.
Eso, the consul. Once took out a presentation and he showed me, look, there were like 500,000 refugees, Colombian refugees in Colombia. This is how much money the Ecuadorian government spends on healthcare for Colombians. And at that point they were like, I don't know, 15,000 Ecuadorians in Colombia, and lots of them had problems with the healthcare system. He said, this is the amount of money, why don't they do the same as we? I mean, it wouldn't be so expensive. But the system just is very reticent to actually let people in. Although more than 70% of the Colombian population is covered, it will always, I mean, the healthcare system, I don't understand why they don't just let people go, I mean, assimilate into the country and pay taxes, and so then you have a right to the healthcare system, right? But they're very reticent to offer more help because there's also the myth, right? And I wrote an article in Spanish about this, you know, these WhatsApp messages, oh, the Venezuelans are letting all the criminals out, they're sending all the people who have AIDS across the border, blah, blah, blah. But there's a very kind of latent fear that all the chronic, people with chronic illnesses are coming in and are going to take all the resources from the healthcare system. So the healthcare system, I don't see how they're going to solve it unless it's through international cooperation that somebody else pays for it.
Well, she's presenting, I think, a very positive picture about the healthcare system. I think probably there's also another side of the healthcare system, because, I mean, the access to emergency also is, what is defined as an emergency can also change. And specifically, there have been, for example, very important discussions about vaccination, and specifically about the reappearance of certain illness, a child like, for example, measles. So probably, I don't know,
the same problem.
The Syrians coming with the measles, maybe these are the Venezuelans coming with the measles, I don't know. So I mean, this is, I think they're maybe not in this dramatic way, or maybe in such a dramatic way. But what I was also interested in, you're actually talking about a large number specifically of young populations. Those migrants are young.
Yeah.
They are families?
They
are families, so they are coming as families.
Well, I think originally the trend was, or among the people, I mean, I'm only working in Bogota and on the border, there are other places, but what I see is young people coming in alone and figuring out how the thing works, and then they bring over. The other thing, I mean, this idea of pendular migration of the Colombian government is absurd, because people in Bogota go back to Venezuela twice a year.
Yes.
Anyway, I mean, it's only 16 hours to the border, and so they go back and they take medicine, they take toothpaste, they take shampoo, I mean, they take really strange things.
Yeah, I mean, we have actually, in Turkey, we have a similar picture. I mean, it's not very new to talk about circular pendular migration in Turkey, but it was Azerbaijan or from Soviet Republic and whatever kind of area, Balkan areas or whatever. So I mean, it's a young population,
It's a young population.
but not necessarily characterized as a family migration.
No.
But then gender issues.
There's a gender issue that's very clear. And then there's something interesting, is at least I've seen, but I haven't seen anybody talk about it, but in the last year, those people already went back and brought their children and their spouses and their sisters, and right? But now they're beginning to bring back la abuelita, you know, the grandmother, and the elderly people that, you know, there's a whole different set of needs there that...
For sure. So it will go beyond education and habits. So there maybe, I mean, I have a number of questions in mind, but I mean, so children out of school, the thing is, those coming, they are actually literate, no? Aren't they?
Yes.
The Venezuelan people had a certain experience of literacy.
They had a much better rate of literacy.
So how can they accept as parents that their children become illiterate?
Well, from
are
what
there eventually other forms of literacy? I mean, maybe different forms of schooling, maybe, I don't know.
That's a wonderful question, but I don't know the answer to it. Like, what I see is that people are just not sending their kids to school. The socialist system in Venezuela, it's very strange. You're talking to people that you read as people that are really, I'm sorry to use this word, but they're screwed, right? They're very poor, no sé qué, but they all own their own houses in Venezuela, right? They're all very proud of the fact that they own their own houses in Venezuela. But I have this thing about documents. I'm obsessed with them. So show me your papers, I'll show you mine. You know, we laugh at each other's pictures. One thing that's really surprising is people take out pictures of fat people. You know, very heavy set man. This is my good life. This is before Maduro was president. You know, very thin, kind of skinny person is at play there. So there was a lot of kind of very good things in place in Venezuela that they're coming from, but I don't think that they're coming from that at this moment. They're coming because they can't pay for food, or they say there's money but there's no food. So I don't think they're thinking about that right now. But there is, I actually think they're more worried about health than education.
More worried about health.
That's my perception from talking to people on the street.
Well, but this would probably, I mean, thinking about when this is relatively new.
Yeah.
So what will happen in 5 years, in 6 years, in 10 years? Probably, I mean, this a kind of a generation uneducated Venezuelan migrants.
It's a vicious circle, right? And then they're going to say, oh, all these young people are criminals because Venezuelan are criminals, but they didn't send them to school.
Besides being criminals, for example, in how can the child labor increase change?
Yeah.
How is this, for example, reflected also in this area, because you're also working on labor, I mean, specifically, or work?
Well, child labor is complicated because it depends on the region, right?
Mm-hmm.
In the cities, it's not so common because it's very well controlled. Colombia wants to become an OECD country and all these things, so we have wonderful child labor laws. Out in the countryside, it's
in
different.
Turkey too, but there is child labor.
Yeah, of course.
So I mean, so in this sense, but for example, countryside, that would be also, I think would be important and interesting to know. It's a huge country, and obviously there are huge areas of unknown, maybe wilderness, I don't know. But I mean, also obviously rural areas. How are they, for example, part of this?
Yeah.
I mean,
it's a great situation to study because nothing has been done yet.
Yeah, that's very.
And it's interesting. Like one of the things that I'm kind of interested in is the patterns for the rural settlement. Why are people? Like this town that I worked in Cajica, it's really a suburb of Bogota, and there's not much there. There's flower plantations. Colombia exports a lot of flowers. But I asked people, why did you come here? Why did you stop here and not go down into the city? And they, you know, the reasons are very hard to understand. Oh, I like this place better. I was afraid of the city. I ran out of money. But they're, I don't know, $2 away from the city. I mean, it's not that difficult. And then there are other regions that people are settling in that I think, because there were so many Colombians in Venezuela, I think that when people came home, they brought their neighbors and they brought their friends. So the regions that had most Colombians sent into Venezuela now have lots of Venezuelans, their connections there.
So because of the family and kinship relationships and networks.
And the networks.
Don't stop me. Because and there are many other questions in mind.
Okay.
He has a question.
I'm sorry. I saw you.
Well, he has me for, okay.
First of all, thank you for presentation. Actually, I would like to ask you about the solutions about this issue. I didn't know that much in chaos in the region, because right now the all lights turn into the Syrian refugee issue, and this is kind of an overshadowed in the world politics. And you also mentioned about 3 blocs or alliances. I don't know how can I say that.
Economic blocs. Yeah.
Blocs, maybe that. So, are there any, let's say, cooperation or any proposal of a solution of this issue, because it's a destabilizing factor within the region, and also most of the countries in Latin America is affected from this issue? Or I'm not just talking about the regional issue, or any of the countries in the region put this motion in forward the Security Council or General Assembly to take the world's attention a little bit from the Syria and this place. So any attempts to do something?
Yes, I think they're very well organized to try to put this on the kind of the world map, and they are putting it on the world map, right? The people are starting to talk about it. In practice, the relations between the countries, I mean, Latin America is so schizophrenic. The relationships between the countries that have this problem, which are basically Colombia, Brazil, but not as many people are going to Brazil. I think they prefer Colombia because Colombian and Venezuelan culture are very, very similar. People from the coast of Colombia now complain that everybody thinks that they're Venezuelans, for example. But Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru have tried to organize this transit, because there's lots of people moving through the countries. But it's very tenuous, right? Whenever something happens in one of those countries, then the country doesn't react in terms of the whole system, it reacts for public opinion. So what happened in Ecuador a couple of months ago was a young girl was murdered by supposedly a Venezuelan migrant, and Ecuador, who had basically made it very easy for people to go in and cross into Peru. People were more interested in crossing into Peru, suddenly closed the border and made everybody have a certificate that said that they weren't criminals, which is something that we have in Latin America. You go to the police and they give you a paper that says that you don't have any legal processes, right? And that's kind of blocked everybody on the border for a while. And again, then there's the international cooperation, the UNHCR, the UNICEF, they're all there on the border trying to help people, but it's very uncertain what's going on. So, and Peru, for example, has a similar permiso especial de permanencia, but it's easier to get. And it's easier to work in your profession in Peru. They don't have all these weird convalidation laws. And so they work with each other, but then it's also politicized, because Venezuela is kind of the last bastion of, it's the cautionary tale for Latin America. Go to the right, because if not, we'll become Venezuela. And so when it becomes so politicized, then they stop really reacting to people's needs. I know I'm not answering, but don't ask an anthropologist about international relations, because, I mean, the solutions for me is the Colombian government should just start by creating a system that everybody has access to, no matter what their situation is. This is the first part. The children will figure out how to send them to school, and the health system, but as long as they create a system where not everybody has access to the basic things because of a silly number, and it's that simple, right? They're just creating inequality, and they're reproducing. I mean, they're creating precarity, and they're creating vulnerability, right? Unnecessarily.
But nicely exploited.
Yes, nicely exploitable, but they're not even exploiting the situation, right? If you think about it, I met this lawyer who specializes in convalidation processes, and he has really weird stories of people with PhDs, of people with very kind of highly specialized medical practice. He says there are 3 people in Colombia who had this specialty, and this guy said he could be sent anywhere, right? He didn't care where they wanted him to work, but they did not convalidate his title for some ridiculous administrative bureaucratic process. My title hasn't been convalidated because they're asking me for a paper that the American universities don't produce. So I have to convince somebody in the university to invent a certificate, only for me, right? You can imagine how hard that is. So, I know I'm not answering, but It's complicated, but be wary whenever they talk about it in the international arena. It all sounds very nice, but it's hyper-politicized, and behind this is kind of this tension, and now, well, I mean, there's another story to now everybody's involved, right? Our president kind of put us into this little mini Cold War in which the United States and the European Union have one position vis-a-vis the Venezuelan government, and then China and Russia and Turkey have another one. And this is for us in Colombia, this is, why did he put us into this situation? Why did he make it escalated to this point in which we might have American drones attacking Venezuela from Colombian territory? Again, this does not go down well in history. This would be a very bad idea in terms of many things. At least that's my opinion. I'm not a raving liberal or something, but you know, it's not a good idea. But it's hyper-politicized.
I just want to, as a continuation of education and also the issue about health, the Turkish government found that, well, it's also maybe an answer to your question, found a good way of solving to some extent. It's through the social assistance programs, social assistance schemes. And how is it? I mean, do they have some rights, or do they have some social assistance schemes, or can get the benefit of the social assistance schemes? I mean, education and health is more or less, okay, we have also. But what about the assistance?
But what do you mean by social assistance? What are you talking
Well, income support, all kinds of poverty support. Poverty alleviation programs, for example.
Not that I know of.
No. Well, that's relatively, I'm not again defending it, but that's how it works. How the Turkish government somehow solved the problem through the assistance programs. And we used to have assistance, and they are now integrated into this assistance program or the Syrian.
I think the question in Colombia, you see it, I've become addicted also to Twitter and social media, because you see the government publish any bit of information and then there's a fight that goes on in the comments, right? And the reaction of Colombia is not a country that was very well off to begin with. There was a lot of inequality among the Colombian population. And so why are they giving social assistance to Venezuelans if Colombians don't have that? And that would create, I think...
Well, that is already creating a lot of conflicts in the Turkish case.
To become assistance, you have to be a registered, documented migrant.
Yes,
So
that is the
if
first
you're an
condition, of course.
undocumented African migrant in Turkey, you won't get this kind of assistance.
But the temporary protection status,
yes,
the Syrians,
the Syrians have a very specific status.
They have a special case for claims from social assistance programs. There are various schemes, not only one. Food support, coal for the heating, and all these. There are different assistance schemes, and they can get the benefit of these schemes, just like the natives. So that also creates conflicts, obviously.
If you have the number.
Well, I mean, if you have the special permit, you have in one way or another access to all these things that Colombians have. But there isn't something like that, like poverty alleviation. We're very neoliberal.
We have not only on the state, we have also NGOs are involved in this bandwagon. There's also Red Crescent, there are all different institutions, they are all helping with the social assistance.
Yeah, well, something similar happens, but it's too many people. I don't see that really working. Like for the returnees, the Red Cross had some interesting programs trying to relocate people and send them to get training in certain things so they could go back to work and stuff like that. But like I say, I mean, not everybody who is a returnee knows that they're a returnee. Right? I'm a returnee. I came back in 2010 and I had no idea that I could ask the government not to charge me taxes for bringing back my books from graduate school. I paid $1,000 in taxes to bring back 8 years of books and a guitar and a bicycle. And looking at all these laws of return, I realized that I had a right to say that I was fighting brain drain and returning to my country to work, and they should have not charged me
We have a special
all that
program
money.
encouraging against the brain drain.
And so I have a PhD, and I didn't know I had access to this. And you know,
but your PhD is not counted.
well, I studied documents. I mean, I should know these things. So it's kind of the red tape involved in all this.
But I think the church probably, and Caritas, for example, probably plays a very important role in charity work.
Yes.
They do, but they also have problems with how that charity gets distributed. Like I worked with the Archdiocese, and they have connections to Caritas and things like that. And they had this, for example, a soup kitchen where they gave people food. And belonging to a university, we tried to organize for the medical school to bring people to have like some sort of medical attention, just very basic. But they canceled it because it was so expensive to maintain, and there was so much fighting between the migrants and also the street people of the downtown area started fighting with the migrants over the food that they decided to, yeah, they decided, well, we'll have to reinvest the money in a different way and make a different type of program, but they're still trying to figure it out. I mean, they have ideas like, oh, we have a space that we could rent out to 4 families and tell them they have 6 months, and then after 6 months we'll return all their rent, they will have saved money up, and they will have, learned to work with each other and do all these things. They have some interesting ideas, but 6 families. This doesn't work on the level of the numbers.
Thank you for your presentation. I wonder which sectors exploit these migrants the most, especially the borderlands, like agriculture, construction.
All the sectors that would employ them. Agriculture, there are 2 agricultural industries, I don't know if it's, right? There's flour production and coffee production that are seasonal things, and they don't have enough people to, nobody wants to go pick coffee, it's not nice. Nobody wants to cut flowers, it's not nice. And so they make these kind of camps with containers in which people live, and then they just move them from one region to the other.
So there are no internal seasonal migrants?
There are, but not many.
Because that's also an issue in Turkey. I mean, seasonal migrants actually in the strongest competition actually with the so-called Syrian refugees. I mean, in specifically agricultural areas, for example, picking whatever kind of.
Yeah, well, the three kind of seasonal industries are the flowers, the coffee, and then tourism. Right after the peace accords, we think that the country is going to become a tourist heaven. Go to Colombia, be a backpacker, blah blah blah. And so, at some point, the government was thinking, well, we can have them pick coffee, do the flowers, and then go to the tourist areas in the tourist season.
To serve the flowers.
Yeah, or the coffee and these things. But, I mean, I see it working informally. But any area in which they work, there's exploitation, like the construction in the cities, which is really regulated. I don't know how exactly they do it, because, everybody has to, if you build your own house, you have to, have everybody with helmets and have there are all these things that you have to do. But if you walk by any construction site, everybody's speaking with a Venezuelan accent, and they're getting paid a fraction of what a Colombian would get paid.
Well, about the Venezuelan migrants, I just want to ask one last question. About do they have, I mean, in Turkey, for example, Syrian migrants, they are mostly, they mostly have rural skills. Since most of them are women and children, the young men are very little, and the professionals are very, very little. Plus, we have also the validation problem like you. So that is why they work in agriculture or in construction or in the risky, dangerous sectors. Whereas in Venezuelan migrants, are they professionals? Do they have rural skills or urban skills?
This is a question about rural or urban migration. My feeling would be that people from rural areas would migrate to rural areas. I don't know. This guy here selling, he's actually a Colombian citizen. He is the guy who jumps out of the ambulance and revives you when you have a heart attack. What is that, a paramedic? And the guy underneath who's selling that, he is a sports teacher who has a university degree in physical education.
So it's actually de-skilling.
So it's de-skilling in many cases. I mean, the guys who work on the public transportation system are interesting because you have to be very industrious. You have to get over being screamed at and people making funny faces. but most of the people on the public transportation system have university or technical degrees. The other lady that I worked with was a nurse. In the south of Bogota, where I've been working with families, there are people that maybe worked construction and they weren't professionals. But it's everybody migration. I mean, most of the people I know in Bogota are from cities, from urban areas.
I think that should be the last question from yours. We tired. You are probably.
Thank you for the presentation.
He's now an unhappy Colombian.
All Colombians are unhappy. I think the people who take the surveys don't understand our problem.
I want to ask about a question about the Colombians themselves. I want to ask a question about the nation building process in Colombia, because you already told about us that migrant issue is already politicized and already used in the elections and everything, and there were distrusts against Venezuelans. And I want to ask how the meaning of being Colombian has changed during this process.
I don't see it as having changed much. Right now, Colombia, because of the peace process and because the current government is trying to go back on it, you kind of are either on one of two sides. You are on the right and you think the government should go back to war and kill everybody, or you're on the left and you're not a leftist and you think that the peace process is a good idea. And a lot of nation building is working in that tension, and the Venezuelan problem gets played into that tension. Now, in 10 years, in 15 years, I don't know how this will have changed. This last picture I have is a sign on the street. The arepa is the most Colombian thing you can have, right? There's an arepa in every region of the country. It's made of maize. It's kind of like a tortilla, but it's thicker. In some places it has cheese and stuff like that. Turns out the Venezuelans have arepas too. They eat it differently. They put meat in it and stuff like that. And there's the only debate about nation building that I've heard is, what these people are doing to our arepas, right? We have to protect Colombian arepas. In 15 years...
Same with the Turkish döner.
Oh, yeah, well...
I don't like it.
in 10, 15 years it might be different. Colombia is very regionalistic in many ways, but a city like Bogota has 10 million people and nobody's from Bogota. Like all our parents were born somewhere else. So in that sense, you don't feel it yet. You feel this kind of right-left tension and how they play into it. Now I can tell you one thing. I went to an international school and my classmates are all more useful than I am in life. They're all engineers and architects and they all have their own companies. And just talking in parties, the architect will complain, well, I have a job opening in my company, but the only people who are applying are Venezuelan. And I certainly am not going to call any of those people to an interview. What are those universities? They all come from Che Guevara University. The people make fun of some of the names of the universities, and I see it playing out like that. Doctors hate Venezuelan doctors. They think that they've brought down the prices of medical practice. But in terms of nation building, I don't think it's too recent.
Thank you.
Wow. Okay, I think it was quite intense. Thank you very, very much.